All right, welcome. Let's get into the directions for my updated complex color wheel demo. For this project, you will need a warm and cool version of each of the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. You will also eventually need some black and white for this project. So if you want to use the exact same colors I'm using, feel free to pause the screen and note those down. You will also need an 11 by 14 inch canvas panel, a graphite pencil, a palette, a ruler. Here you can see my canvas panel, and I'm getting ready to start mapping things out with the pencil. Step 1, use some objects as circle templates, such as plates, bowls, cups, or anything else that you have. I'm demonstrating the first largest circle, and now I'm doing the next circle. These are basically dividing the rings for the color wheel. And I'm using a light lead pencil. You can use whatever pencil you want, but the lighter lead pencils are a bit easier to use for various reasons. One is that they just don't smudge as badly as the darker, softer leads. But here you can see so far I have 3 rings. Now I'm doing a 4th to finish off that inner ring. And there you go. I've got some rings. And I made an effort to make them all kind of centered so they're not too wonky. And step 2, we're going to do some center lines both vertically and horizontally. So here I'm just kind of using a ruler to kind of get an idea of where the center of that inner circle is, because I want to try to get these lines centered vertically and horizontally through the circles. So I would say anything like a 12-inch ruler or longer would be good for this project. All right, now I've divided them in fourths, as you can see, and step 3, I need 12 pie slices total. So within each of those fourths, I'm just making 2 little marks so that I can divide each of those fourths into 3 pie slices. So 3, 6, 9, 12. I'll have 12 total. And this part is always kind of the most confusing for students, so you can always rewind or pause and kind of follow along while you're doing the project. But, just take your time. Craftsmanship matters, so try to get your straight lines with your ruler and try to have the pie slices somewhat of the same looking size, So I have 12 pie slices of equal size mapped out in the pencil, and I'm ready to go on to the next step, which is labeling the position of your primaries. So I put down red. I counted 1, 2, 3 pie slices before putting down blue, and then counted 1, 2, 3, and then I got to yellow. Now step 5, we're going to divide each of these primaries in half so that we can have the warm and cool side of each of the primaries within those primary pie slices. So you can see it's only the red, blue, and yellow that I had marked that get divided. Now I'm labeling the warm and cool side of each of those primaries. Feel free to pause the video once I've marked them down if you want to copy in the same position on your color wheel, because the position does matter. Using the warm and cool primaries will give us the widest selection of really nice, beautiful, clean, saturated secondary colors. All right, so I'm kind of laying out some colors that I'm going to be using. Now we are going to start with that second ring. And this is going to be all just pure color. So there will be no white or black needed for this first ring that we're going to work on. The black and white will come into play later when we fill in the outer and inner rings. So step 6, we're going to paint in the primaries on that second ring first. So this is why it's so important that we label those primaries and the warm and cool sides. So, you know, like I said, the position of the colors matters. So this gets us off to a good start, because it can get confusing if you're not kind of paying attention to where you're laying in your color. I'm going to start with the red primary. So you can see I put out some warm and cool versions of the red. I believe the warm red I'm using is a Cad Red Light, and the cool red that I'm using is a quinacridone red. Another common cool red in oil paint is alizarin crimson, so that's another great choice. I've got some linseed oil handy in case I need to help improve the flow of the paint on the canvas, because sometimes the paint straight out of the tube will kind of be very dry. So here you can see I had gotten my brush just a little bit wet with that linseed oil. The linseed oil helps improve the flow of the paint without thinning down the paint too much, because I'm going to go for a bit more of like just a good opaque coverage of paint here. And I'm staying within the lines. The video is sped up just to have a reasonable time for showing you this demo, but you know, so it looks like I'm doing it really fast, but I'm actually doing it a bit slower. So do take your time and make sure that you're cleaning your brush in the solvent in between each color change. So I cleaned my brush in some solvent, got the excess solvent off on my rag before going into that cool red to fill in the little area that I'm filling in right now with the cool toned red. So there you have it. I have the primary red filled in with the warm and cool side. I've stayed within the lines, tried to get a really even, you can see how I go over with my brush multiple times just to even out the application of paint so that it looks really nice and flat and even. And now I'm going to go on to the next primary, yellow. I've got my warm and cool yellow ready. I've cleaned my brush with the solvent, which is off camera. And I'm laying out my yellow paints. So I believe I'm using a cadmium yellow for the warm yellow, and I'm using a Hansa yellow light for the cool yellow. So the warm yellow is going to be closer to the warm red side of the wheel, and the cool yellow will be closer to the blue side of the color wheel. I got a little smudge on there, so what I did was I just grabbed my rag with some solvent to try to lift that up, and I did smudge my pencil lines a bit, but you'll see later that I clean up that whole inner part more with my rag and solvent. You can see there I got some solvent on the brush to try to pick it up a little bit. So, you know, if that happens, you can always do some cleanup work there. You could see I'm really picking it up with my rag. So I'm filling in the warm yellow here. You can see how I'm resting my hand down on the canvas as I'm filling it in. So just make sure that when you're doing this, you're not putting your hand into one of the areas you've already painted with wet paint. So you can do your best to try to avoid smudging any of the areas you've already filled in. Now, what I did for this demo was I worked on this second ring all in one sitting, and then there's a few days of a break before I came in to do the inner and outer ring. But if you're planning to do this whole project in one sitting, you may want to use larger amounts of paint mixtures on your palette than what you see in this demo. When I start mixing color, I'm kind of using smaller amounts because I know I'm not going to do the whole thing in one sitting. But again, if you are planning to do the whole thing in one sitting, I would suggest larger paint amounts, because when you mix your colors, oh, here you can see I finished the primary. So now I'm going to work on the secondaries. So with this whole second ring of pure color, you know, when you finish that, and if you're gonna within one sitting go in and do your tints and shades on the inner and outer rings, you would have that leftover paint from that second ring to adjust with your tints and shades. So just something to think about. Moving on to step 7, paint in the secondaries and tertiaries. No neutrals, so no black or white in this second ring. It's only pure color. Okay, so you can see here I took half of my warm blue and half of my cool red to mix together. Keep in mind that this will be a bit of trial and error for you guys if this is your first time doing a color wheel. So certain colors are stronger than others. For example, sometimes blue is has a very high tinting strength, which means you might not need as much of it in a color mixture to change the color towards blue, whereas your red might be just a slightly weaker. So it's not always like gonna work to have like a 50% blue, 50% red to get a perfect purple in between. You may have to adjust a little bit, for example, using just a touch more red than you think you might need. So just keep that in mind. But what I'm doing is I'm doing the secondary color, which is the purple. So right in between that cool red and warm blue. So as you can see, the position of the colors on the wheel tell you what colors to use to mix to get your secondaries and tertiaries. For example, the next one that I'm going in with is using that purple mixed with the warm blue to get that tertiary color. So this tertiary color will be right in between. Now, also keep in mind, when you get to those cooler, transparent colors, like as things get closer to blue, it's naturally going to look a bit darker. It might be a bit harder to see the color because it's so dark. I kind of try to thin out the paint a little bit because the white of the canvas sort of shows through to illuminate the color a little bit to make it a little bit easier to see. But you'll also see, for example, later on when we do the shades in the purples and blues, it gets very, very dark, and it is very difficult to see the difference in the color when it gets that dark. But just do your best. You know, this is sort of a learning process to see what happens with color when we do these different things. How do different pigments react differently? For example, there's certain pigments that are more transparent, which you're going to see more in the cool colors, and certain pigments that are more opaque, which you're going to see more in the warm colors. And certain pigments will be a little bit harder to get an even application with. For example, ultramarine blue is notorious for being a little bit difficult to get a really smooth, even application of paint. So it might look a little bit streaky, and that's normal. Just do your best to get it as even as you can, but if it's not perfect, that's okay. Just do your best to, to keep your paint within the lines, and you should be fine. So I've completed the range of purples. I've got that sort of reddish purple and bluish purple within that area, and now I'm going to move on to the greens. So I'm going to use my cool blue with my cool yellow to create my secondary color, which is green, using my palette knife to mix. So this is really important, guys. Use your palette knife to mix your color, not your brush. This is going to be more efficient, and it's going to help you keep the color on your palette rather than just soaking all the color into your brush. And always, always, always clean your brush in between each color that you apply. I will also recommend that you do your best to keep your palette organized. So kind of keep track of like which color that you've laid out is your warm or cool primary. You could even write down little notes by the color mixtures, or if things get too messy, you can always clean a certain area of your palette and to kind of like clean things up and allow for some sort of organization, because if things get too chaotic, you're going to forget what color is what and it's going to mess up your wheel. All right, cleaning the brush. Now I'm going to divide that green so I can get the tertiaries. So I'll get some of that green mixed in with the cool yellow, and then the other half of that green will get mixed into the cool blue. Using the palette knife to thoroughly mix the color. And I didn't really talk about what brush I'm using, but if you're using a synthetic hair flat or bright shaped brush, I would say that's a good choice, because the flat shape or kind of squared off shape of the brush helps you get those crisp edges. And it helps you just kind of get the control to paint within those lines. So there you can see I'll kind of like go over the whole thing in one direction and then in the other direction to just kind of really smooth out the paint. Once I'm satisfied that it looks nice and smooth, I'll go over to the next color. So now I'm mixing the cool blue with the green to get that blue-green mixture for that tertiary color. Grabbing the paint with the brush and applying it. Now, there's going to be times where you might have to adjust the color if you didn't really get much difference in between these different colors. So, each pie slice should look a bit different. If you're seeing some of your pie slices looking the same, that's an indication that you might have to go back and make an adjustment. So stay open to change. You can always adjust things by painting on top, or if you have too much paint down and it's difficult to change the color, you can always use your rag to pick up some of that color so that you can then put down the correct color. So, this project does take time and patience. It's not something you can rush through or do quickly. There you can see it's kind of a transparent color, so I'm having a bit difficulty getting an even application, and it's not perfect, but I'm just doing the best I can to get it as even as possible. All right, I'm almost done with this second ring. Now I'm going to move on to see how I flipped the canvas so that I can more easily reach those orange colors. Keep that in mind. You can always rotate the canvas just so that you can rest your hand down on a clean part of the canvas. All right, so I'm going to mix the warm red with the warm yellow to get a very typical orange secondary color here. There you can see I'm working on the palette to get that orange. Get my clean brush, dip into that orange, and see what I get. I had to grab a little linseed oil to help the flow of the paint. Really trying to get those clean edges there. These oranges are usually more on the opaque side, so it is a little easier to get an even application in these colors because you're mixing cad red with cad yellow, and those are more opaque pigments. I have had students use the approach of like all their color swatches being very transparent. Like if you like thin everything down with linseed oil or solvent to kind of almost to like a watercolor consistency, that can work too, as long as you're consistent with it. Like as long as you're kind of staying consistent with that kind of application with all your color swatches and not just some of them. Because if you're going like super thinned down with some of your color swatches and then super opaque with some of your other color swatches, it's going to feel inconsistent and it's not going to be a real strong color wheel. Because keep in mind, if you're going for this more kind of like transparent watercolor thinned out approach with your paint, more of the white of the canvas will show through your paint, right? Whereas if you're going for more of a heavy opaque application of paint, you won't see the white of the canvas affecting your color showing through, right? So there won't be that sort of luminous look to it. So it kind of depends on how you want your color wheel, what kind of approach. Like if you normally paint with very kind of thin down applications in this kind of more watercolor approach, then that might be a good approach for you for your color wheel. But otherwise, if you tend to paint more opaquely with decent coverage, which is how a lot of people paint with oil paints, then, that would be the approach you want to have the goal to achieve in your color wheel. Because this color wheel can be, when you're done with it, it's basically going to be a tool for you to help you figure out how to mix certain colors that you want with your specific arrangement of paints that you have. So keep in mind, for example, I'm using, for my cool red, for example, I'm using a quinacridone red. Maybe some of you are using a different one, like a alizarin crimson, and therefore your ranges of purples might look slightly different than what I have, right? So it's kind of nice for you guys to make your own wheel like this, so it can be a tool for you later on when you're painting other things to reference and see what kind of color selections can I get with my paints and what do I need to use to mix a specific color. There you can see that whole second ring is complete. And at this point I took a break, so there's a couple days in between this stage and the next stage. So it did have a chance to dry, which was kind of nice because I didn't have to worry about smudging it. But again, if you want to do this project all in one sitting, you certainly can. But just keep in mind that it will take some time. So if you're doing it all at once, it will take some time. And you can see there's little imperfections in there, especially in the transparent colors. It was a bit harder to get a really even application, but in general, there's an effort shown there to get an even application. Everything's within the lines and it looks pretty good in terms of craftsmanship. And on to step 8. I'm going to work on the outer ring to add black to my color, which is shading the color, and the inner ring will have the tints, which is adding white. So basically, here I'm working on shading the green or the yellow-green color. So that same yellow-green I got from doing that second ring, I just added black to it. And I try to add just a teeny tiny bit of black, because if you add too much, it will just turn completely black and then you won't really see much difference of color in that outer ring. So I highly suggest going really slow as you introduce colors to your mixture so you can kind of see what they're doing. So I added just a tiny bit of black to that yellow green on my palette, and now I added a little bit of black to the cool yellow color to show the shade, what it looks like to shade that color. And you're going to notice with this outer ring that the differences of the color swatches will be pretty subtle as you move through. There will be differences, but it'll be subtle. Try to try to get the values kind of similar in that outer ring as well as the inner ring. I will say it definitely looks a lot better and more cohesive for your color wheel if you keep the values of the swatches similar. However, because as you move towards blue, because blue is naturally a darker color, you will notice that, you know, your values might naturally go a bit darker, and that's okay. But just try to get a bit of consistency. Like, for example, you don't want your shaded yellow swatch there on the outer ring to be like a vastly darker value than the one that's next to it, right? You want to, like, I can see I'm having a little bit of difference in values. I think later I go back and make little adjustments to try to get them a little bit more similar, but sometimes you just got to see it. You got to see it on the canvas when they're next to each other. It's hard to judge when it's only on the palette first. But yeah, you can always adjust it later if you don't get quite the right ratio of black and color. And like I said, as we move it closer to those blues, things are going to get pretty dark pretty fast, and it's going to be a bit harder to see the difference in color. But just keep your application kind of more like thin, and just, you know, that kind of helps the white of the canvas to show through just a bit, to kind of illuminate that color, so it's a little bit easier to see. Otherwise everything is just going to look black. But as you can see, craftsmanship matters. I am, you know, trying my best to stay within the lines and to get an even application of the paint, and trying not to get my hand into any of the wet areas of paint. Just trying to take my time and trying to stay organized, trying to keep my palette organized. Always cleaning my brush in between the color swatches. Here you can see between yellow and blue, I'm now getting some tints on that inner ring. And within that inner ring, I will try to keep the values somewhat similar. So now I've added white to that yellow-green color and adding the tint to the inner ring for that section. Now I've added white to the green color and applying it into that inner ring for that section. The tints go a little bit faster because they're on that smaller inner ring, so there's kind of less to fill in, and also because you're adding white, it just naturally will make everything opaque. So all your paint swatches within that inner ring are going to be opaque due to the titanium white. All right, I've added some white to that bluish green color. Remember how earlier in the demo I had gotten a smudge kind of close to the middle of the, it was on the, I had smudged the graphite pencil lines kind of close to the center. So I just used my rag with some solvent to clean up that center part of the wheel. And, you know, you get the idea, right, for how to fill the rest of this in. So here's my finished result. You can certainly label on the outside more of the colors if you want, but I think the most important thing is labeling your primaries and the warm and cool sides of each primary. The rest is kind of easy to figure out in terms of placing your color. But yeah, my suggestion is go slow, take your time, stay organized, keep your palette organized, and do your best with the craftsmanship. But here's the finished result. Hope you enjoyed this demo. Hopefully the directions were clear, and yeah, Always happy to answer questions, so if you have any, drop them in the comments below. And thank you so much for your time. I'll see you in the next video.